terrific song leading. It was a blessing to have you lead us this morning. Very inspirational. Now we know where Noah gets his fantastic song leading ability. That was wonderful. Thank you. We're going to continue our lesson on peacemaking this morning. We're right in the middle, sort of a fairly long series of lessons. The lesson has applicability to all of us of all ages. There's a number of kids here, teenage kids. This applies to you too as well. So I invite you to pay special attention. It will help all of us have better relationships with one another, and most importantly, have peace with God and with ourselves. And we'll talk about that. I have been asked by several of you to slow down on these lessons. I'm going to do that this morning, later. I'm going to speed up right now as we review the last two lessons for the benefit of all of our visitors and those who were unable to attend the first two. So buckle up here for the next few minutes. I'm going to try to get it done in 5 minutes, just to kind of bring us all to the same page so we're all in the same place. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." It's one of the greatest, I can argue the greatest beatitude of all, because we will be called children of God. We, in the previous lessons, we talked a lot about the prophecy. That was the scriptural foundation, where these prophets from 700 and some years before Jesus was ever born predicted that Jesus would come and he would be our peace, as Micah said. Isaiah prophesied that Jesus would be the Prince of Peace. Yet at the same time, and I apologize for going so fast, I will slow down in a few minutes, but I'm going to blast through this. Jesus said at the same time, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." And he talked about that he came to put family against one another, friends against one another. He was quoting actually from that same prophet who called him peace, Micah. But did Jesus have a peaceful life? Was Jesus at peace with all men? We answered that no. And so biblical peace is quite complex. There are actually 3 types of peace, and we're going to go through them again and review this morning. Then we'll be diving into this morning's lesson. Type 1 peace is peace with one another. It's the one we all think about. It's the one you read about in popular culture. It's the one that parts of the Bible talk about, such as Romans and Hebrews, when he talks about living at peace with all men, and as much as it's within your power to do so. But the real peace of the Bible, the real reason Jesus came, was to promote and create peace and become a peacemaker between God and man. And that is the fundamental responsibility of all of us. We went through a lot of scripture on that. Type 3 peace is peace with ourselves, peace with our shortcomings, peace with the way we look, peace with the way we are. We used Paul as an example there, the thorn in his flesh, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul had asked God to take it away from him. It was obviously something to do with sin because the devil tormented him over it. And God said, "My grace is sufficient." We brought about certain examples in the Bible of all 3 types of peace. We asked ourselves the question in the previous lessons, which type of peace, which of the 3 types was Jesus talking about when he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers"? Was it type 1, type 2, type 3, or all of it? We're going to make the case in future lessons that Jesus was talking about type 2 peace in that verse. We introduced this chart. Ken Sandy is a Christian researcher who came up with a lot of these human behaviors and very organized them very well on this continuum. I have adopted that, and I've modified it slightly based on my Bible study and my research in the area. And we took time to go through it. You all have the handout in front of you. I actually handed all of them out, and I saw a few people come in late. Would you raise your hand if you do not have one of these in front of you? If some of you who have multiple ones in your family, between couples, could kind of share with those people, that would be great. On the left side are the escape responses of denial, flight, and suicide. On the right side are the attack responses of assault, litigation, and ultimately murder. We're going to be spending a lot of time talking about attack today. On the left side are the peace-faking responses. This is peace-breaking. But in the middle is where we want to be, peacemaking. The beautiful peacemaking responses of overlooking, which should dominate most of our responses. Reconciliation and negotiation. Those are the sort of personal peacemaking, where we're doing it just between us and another person. On the right side of the peacemaking responses are mediation, accountability, and arbitration. Those are the more assisted peacemaking behaviors. And so we want to find ourselves here in the center and avoiding the extremes of attack and escape. We talked a lot about peacekeeping and how God doesn't call us to be peacekeepers. He calls us to be peacemakers. We talked about the dangers of appeasing. We talked about the dangers of passive-aggressive enabling. The right side of the chart tends to be more public, more forced, where the focus is on you. The left side of the chart, the escape peace-faking responses, tends to be more private, voluntary, when the focus is on me. But in the center, where the peacemaking is, the focus is on God. Both extremes result in damage to relationships, loss of relationships, and in the extreme, death. We brought about a very crisp definition of conflict being the difference in opinion or purpose that frustrates or disrupts someone's goals or desires. Because there are three types of peace, there are also three types of conflicts. Conflict with others, conflict with God, and conflict with ourselves. We talked about reframing conflict in our minds to be an opportunity instead of something to be avoided. Spent a lot of time talking about that. How we're called to run toward conflict as Jesus did. Because every time you encounter a conflict, you will inevitably show what you really think of God. I'm going to say that again. Every time you encounter a conflict, whether it's your own conflict that you're involved in, or whether it's someone else's conflict that you are trying to facilitate being a peacemaker within, you will inevitably show what you really think of God, because you will fall somewhere on this set of behaviors. We talked about conflict as an opportunity to glorify God, to trust God, obey God, imitate God, acknowledge God. And we went over all of the scriptures associated with those opportunities. Talked about it being an opportunity to serve others, to agape love, to carry one another's burdens, an opportunity to teach and encourage, an opportunity to be more like Jesus. We also dove straight head in the last lesson about how type 1 peacemakers breathe grace. That was the main takeaway of that lesson. In breathing grace, we inhale and we exhale. We inhale grace from above. These scriptures say God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So there's a necessity for us to be humble when we're peacemaking, a humble when we breathe grace, non-judgmental, non-condemning. We don't need to be taking on God's role and playing God with ourselves or with one another. It's God's responsibility. It's God's prerogative to judge. Let's make sure we're not playing God. As the saying goes, even God himself does not judge a man until the end of his days. Neither should we. So then we dove straight into a couple of the escape responses. I'll go through those quickly. We talked about Jesus when they brought him the woman caught in adultery. We talked about how Jesus was able to show all three types of peacemaking in that great example. We'll get into that again. Type 1 peacemaking in the previous lesson, we talked about how type 1 peacemakers breathe grace but avoid peacekeeping. And we use Jacob as an example, the ultimate appeasing enabler. A man who tried to keep the peace with his sons, but really didn't, because he wasn't peacemaking. He was just sort of appeasing them and peacekeeping. And of course, we all know what the end result of that was. Last lesson, we also talked about denial and how Abram, as an example, was denying the issue between Hagar and Sarai, his wife. And ultimately, that conflict ended up becoming catastrophic because he refused to engage as a peacemaker. Okay, that's the previous lessons in a nutshell. So now I'm going to slow down. And that note is to me, Kelley, slow down. So that's what we'll do. What we're going to do is we're going to finish the last two behaviors on escape responses, then we'll be jumping over to the attack responses, something we need to be very, very careful of and be able to recognize. And I'm going to present to you this morning some countermeasures that we can deploy, very pragmatic lessons, something practical that you can take with you, something we can do to bounce out of attack responses very responsibly. Now, when it comes to flight, type 1 peacemakers breathe grace, and they avoid flight unless it's absolutely necessary. What do we mean by flight? Now, I'll be the first one to say that there will be times when you're engaged with someone where you need to get away. That's going to happen. There are going to be times when you're going to need a break. There may be even times when you choose for your own well-being, whether it's your own emotional well-being, your own spiritual well-being, and even your own physical well-being, to terminate a relationship. Brothers and sisters, we need to recognize that not all relationships are intended to be perfect. And there is a time and a place to flee. But peacemakers don't do that by habit. Type 1 peacemakers don't flee as a matter of instinct choice. They only flee when absolutely necessary. I'm going to give you two examples, David and Jesus. 1 Samuel chapter 19 talked about how Saul was trying to kill David. He threw a sword, right? Tried to pin David against the wall. The spear was thrown so hard it actually penetrated the wall. Jesus in Luke chapter 4, when he was talking about the prophecy in Isaiah being fulfilled through his speaking, the people were trying to kill him, and Jesus escaped. So there are extremes. But on the other hand, there are also times when we should not flee, or if we have fled, we want to re-engage back into the conflict so that we can bring about peace, particularly type 2 peace. And we'll get into that. A couple examples, Paul and Barnabas, if you might remember from Acts chapter 15, had such a sharp disagreement over John Mark, that they decided to part ways. Now, yes, this is the same Mark that years later, wrote the Gospel of Mark. But you have to wonder what would have happened. That powerhouse of Paul and Barnabas staying together, how much more could they have done had they not had that conflict that resulted in the escape, peace-faking response of flight? Then we've got Abraham and Lot. I'll bring that up. Genesis 19. You might remember that Abraham and Lot's people were having such a dispute that Abraham and Lot decided to part ways forever. Ultimately, Lot ended up in Sodom and Gomorrah. We'll remember that when Lot left, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt, and Lot's daughters made the brilliant decision that they weren't going to be able to find husbands, so they just decided and conspired with one another, gee, let's get our father drunk and we'll take turns having sex with him and we'll be able to become pregnant by him. Those incestuous relationships resulted in the nation of Moab and the Ammonites, which later became an absolute scourge to Israel, bringing on all sorts of idolatry and evil that went on for 1,000 years. The next peace-breaking response of suicide, we'll talk about that briefly. Type 1 peacemakers breathe grace and they get help for people struggling with suicide ideation. There are 7 suicides mentioned in the Bible. There's Abimelech, Samson. You can argue Samson knew he was going to die anyway. He was later praised in Hebrews as a man of faith. Saul and his armor bearer, Ahithophel, Zimri, and of course the most famous one, Judas. There are 11 cases of suicide ideation or suicide attempts in the Bible. Now, the subject of suicide, physical suicide, is outside the scope of this lesson. If you, and chances are in a group this large of people here, there's someone you know or you yourself might be struggling with that, And a type 1 peacemaker will help get that person professional help. But I do want to mention a few things about suicide as it relates to peace. The first thing I want to emphasize is that type 2 peace and type 3 peace tend to mediate suicide ideation, where type 1 peace tends to moderate suicide ideation. Now, this idea of mediation and moderation, what does that mean? A mediator is something that serves to explain either the reasons why or how a certain thing happens. A moderator is something that provides an indication of the strength of a relationship or the direction of a relationship. So what does that mean in plain terms? That means that while type 1 peace, the peace we have with one another, might either strengthen this idea of suicide ideation, but it's not going to cause it typically. Suicide ideation is mediated by the reasons it happens, the how that it happens is generally from type 2 peace or the lack thereof, and type 3 peace or the lack thereof. The other thing I'll emphasize is that potentiation matters. Now that's a big fancy $10 word. What does it mean? Potentiation is what happens in our neural pathways where it sort of burns or etches a path chemically and electrically. You can look here on Kauai and you can see it happening even in the mountains, right? So it rains and that turns into little paths of water which get deeper and deeper and turn into streams, which turn into brooks, which turn into rivers. And once you have that going on in your mind, the simple fact is, and God teaches us this, that the brain becomes used to going there. You have a potentiation that happens, and that matters. The other thing I'll mention in terms of young people is that emotional suppression mediates suicide ideation in adolescence. And that ideation increases the odds of future attempts. 6.3% of teens from the ages of 13 to 17 in the United States actually attempt suicide. That's a shockingly high number, and we need to be there and help with that. What I want to focus on in terms of suicide this morning is more the metaphorical suicide, the emotional, mental suicide that we can engage in, the social suicide, the spiritual suicide. Now, healthcare professionals, when it comes to our emotional hurting ourselves, call that cognitive distortions. Somebody who's engaging that where you might get a headache and say, oh, I have a headache, I need to lay down. Someone who has cognitive distortion might say to themselves, there's something wrong with me. I can't even handle the pressures of life. Look, I have a headache. It's common among all of us, but much worse in victims of childhood sexual abuse. There's the social suicide where we isolate ourselves. I have a friend in Ohio who struggles with this. Difficult getting along with others, difficult having peace with others. So there's this sort of isolation. I can't get along with everyone, therefore I'm going to isolate. God doesn't want that. He teaches us in Ecclesiastes and in Proverbs that it's good to be around other people to help one another. Spiritual suicide, something I actually struggle with myself, where I say to myself, man, Kelley, you are just not a good Christian. You got these problems. And it makes me not want to be a Christian on some level. I even talk to myself, you're a lousy speaker. You're a lousy preacher. Don't like the way I have my meter, the way I speak, and the emphasis I put on certain words. And it's discouraging when we do that. We want to be very, very careful. Okay, so now we're going to jump over to the attack responses. And the first thing I'll say about that is this. It's nearly impossible for you to be a type 1 peacemaker while you are being attacked. And we need to remember that. When you're over here and either getting attacked or watching someone get attacked, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to be a type 1 peacemaker. And we're going to talk about a path out of that. How many people know who this is from a long time ago? Would you just, by show of hands, not the actor, but the character in the movie? Okay, Noah, who is it?
Rocky.
It's Rocky, isn't it? Rocky Balboa. We're going to take a lesson from Rocky. I was a freshman in high school in 1978. I'd never been in a fight my entire life. I've been in one fight my whole life, and it was my freshman year. Now, mind you, I was a little shrimpy kid, all of 4 feet something and maybe 70 pounds soaking wet, little tiny weenie arms like that. Not very strong or big at all. And there was a kid probably about my size that called my mom a nasty word. I'll just leave it at that. And we were kind of at words with one another, and all of a sudden the rest of the kids were like, well, you guys should fight this out. And so in those days, after school, what would happen if someone was going to have a fight? The upperclassmen would get in a circle and they would lock arms with one another and create sort of a ring, and that was 2 or 3 deep. And he and I were in the middle of this ring, and I'm like, I'm going to die. And I'm sure he felt the same way. And they would do that, create that circle for 2 reasons. One is so that we couldn't get out. It was like we were in a cage fight. The other reason is so the teachers couldn't get in, because they would create this ring 3 or 4 people deep. And we were in this ring, and he put up his fist and came after me, and I put up my fist too. And I must have tagged him just right, because when he came at me, I hit him, and I caught him right on the eye. And he got this huge, I now know it to be called a hematoma, but there was this massive lump on his head, right above his eye. It swollen his eyes closed. After that, all of the people in the school, I had a new nickname. Now, mind you, a little kid like this with little teeny tiny spaghetti arms. They called me Rocky. Now, I had never seen Rocky. I was a sheltered country boy from rural Ohio. Hadn't even seen the movie, didn't know anything about it. But I wanted to after that. Now, in those days, it's hard to believe, but we'd get whacked for fighting. So I had a choice between 5 whacks or 5 days suspension. I chose the 5 whacks. And, of course, they did it in the hallway where everybody could hear. And the board was about 5 feet long, holes in it, the whole scene. They hit you, and I was so light, lifting me clear off the ground. Tears rolling down my cheeks. But then I heard in the distance, because what would happen, the kids, the upperclassmen, as I would walk around, for 2 or 3 weeks after this fight, this kid was walking around with a big lump. Every time I'd walk down the hallway, all the football players and the upperclassmen would throw themselves against the wall like this, against the lockers, and they would sing the Rocky theme. Dun, 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 dun. And then they would chant Rocky. Well, as I was getting whacked, I heard this chant, Rocky, Rocky, Rocky. It made the other 3 whacks a lot easier to take. But there's something that Rocky did. And I later learned that there was a second Rocky movie that was about to come out. Now I'm old enough to actually go see the movie. And Rocky 1 was on TV. Right? Remember, this is the 70s. No internet, no VCRs. Broadcast TV with 3 channels. Hard to imagine such a life, isn't it? But I watched the Rocky movie. And I was impressed by the one thing that Rocky did. Because it's nearly impossible to be a type 1 peacemaker while you're being attacked. Remember what Rocky did? His trainer, I think his name was Mickey. His trainer taught him to fight right-handed. He was a left-handed southpaw fighter, but he completely changed his approach and fought right-handed. Then in the middle of this rematch fight, in the second series of Rocky, he switched back to being a southpaw. And I want to use that as an example to give you a very practical this lesson morning that Jesus also did, and we'll look at that. When being attacked or witnessing someone being attacked, immediately pivot from type 1 peacemaking to type 2 and type 3 peacemaking. There is a very practical thing we can do to get out of that situation of being attacked. When you're being attacked, because I can tell you from personal experience, when you're being bombarded and being attacked, you are not at your best. And you are not able to really be an effective type 2 or type 1 peacemaker. But I assure you, you can switch to type 2 peacemaking and facilitate that peace between the other party and God, or that peace between the other party and, frankly, themselves. Because we're called to be type 2 peacemakers. And I assure you that generally speaking, when someone is attacking another person, they lack type 2 peace and probably lack type 3 peace. They lack that peace that passes all understanding, that peace with God, and they lack peace with themselves. So yes, Type 1 peacemakers breathe grace. And type 1 peacemakers effectively pivot to type 2 and type 3 peacemaking. So, how can we recognize when we're being attacked? First off, if you yourself are being attacked, you might pay attention to your nervous system. God gave you something that will give you an indication. Your heart rate will go up, your body will start changing, your blood pressure will go up. You will feel it when you're being attacked. That is a good quality indicator for you to switch, just like Rocky switched from right-handed to left-handed, to switch from type 1 to type 2 peacemaking. When it comes to others, watch their responses. We instinctively know, we're given this God-given sort of protection instinct for other people. We know when someone is being attacked. Jesus said it this way. You've heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. And this word love we have to focus on for a minute, because the love mentioned here is not phileo. It's not the same love mentioned here. It's agape. Yes, it is important to pray for our enemies. That's necessary, but not sufficient. We also need to take action. We're called by God to have that action-oriented, servant-oriented, agape love for our enemies. Paul said in Romans, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. In so doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. And I got a question for the brothers and sisters who are here. When you've read this verse in the past, and you think about this idea of heaping burning coals on his head, how many of you thought that Paul was referring to some sort of punishment, or he's got his dues coming to him, or something that would harm the other person in some way? Anybody? Okay, good. I want to invite you to reconsider this idea of coals being heaped on another person's head. If you could turn to Isaiah in your Bibles if you'd like to. I'm just going to review the call of Isaiah. You might remember there, it was in the year of Uzziah, I think it was, and Isaiah was being called to serve God, called to go to Judah and prophesy. And he saw the throne of God. He saw the angels there, and he saw all the seraphim, what they were doing, and he was overwhelmed in the presence of God. And he was like, woe is to me, because I have seen the presence of God, and I have unclean lips and unclean hands, and I'm among a people who are unclean. And what did God do? God sent an angel who picked up a coal off the altar with tongs, and the angel brought it to Isaiah, and he touched his lips with it. And he said, that coal has made you clean, has made you whole. And I would invite us to reconsider that when we're kind to our enemies, when we're do something that God wants us to do, and that heaping of burning coals is actually a purification that is going on, much like Isaiah. Type 1 peacemakers breathe grace. Type 1 peacemakers effectively pivot to type 2 and type 3 peacemaking. And finally, type 1 peacemakers know who the real enemy is. Knowing who the real enemy is gives us strength to be able to pivot. Paul said it this way, for our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms. 1 Peter made it very clear. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Yes, our enemy is Satan. And if we can reframe that as peacemakers, if we can remember that the person who we're involved with a conflict, whether it's our own or someone else, that the people aren't the problem, that Satan is the problem. Not only does it give us strength, but it helps us frame the situation in such a way that we can be much better type 1 peacemakers. This beautiful story about Jesus and the woman who was caught in adultery. We got to remember, Jesus was also under attack there. He was being attacked by the very same people who were holding the stones, who had brought the woman, without the man, by the way, to be stoned in front of Jesus, trying to trap him and get him to slip up. He was under attack. First thing he did is he took time. He stopped. He thought. He waited. The second thing he did, if you notice, He switched immediately from trying to bring peace between them and the woman to trying to bring peace between those people holding the stones and God. He immediately switched, just like Rocket, switched from type 1 peacemaking to type 2 peacemaking. What did he say? In that brilliant moment, he said, "Let he is without sin cast the first stone." What did that do? That caused all these people who were standing around holding the stones, one at a time, began self-evaluating themselves. They began to say, "Hey, am I without sin? Do I need to humble myself in this situation?" And then, of course, one by one, the stones fell. And type 1 peace was achieved through and by type 2 peace. We need to do the same. All right, guerrilla warfare. How many of you are familiar? You don't need to raise your hand, but many of you might have been in a situation where you were in a conflict in the military. Perhaps some of you in Vietnam, I happen to know that. And others where you have small insurgents that sort of come out. They call it guerrilla warfare, where you have small insurgencies that come out and either ambush and then they escape. They attack and do great damage, and then they blend in to society where you can't see them. Satan knows this as well, and he gets us often to engage in guerrilla warfare, where we oscillate back and forth between peace breaking and then sort of coming right back through here and engaging in peace faking, the escape responses. I'm going to share with you all a true story. I'm going to do it in 5 minutes, and then the lesson is yours. This will be the last thing we talk about. I'm going to share with you a story about leadership in a church that got into this guerrilla warfare. I'm not going to name the church. I'm not going to name the people. Angie and I are familiar with a congregation where the leadership, the elders in the church, were counseling with a woman and her husband. They were having difficulty in their marriage. And they were in a room, and the woman wanted to leave. She asked to leave. She got up and started walking toward the door. Whereupon, one of the elders reached out, grabbed the door, and big guy, huge guy, reached out, grabbed the door, put his foot in front of it, and said, "You're not going anywhere." Made her sit back down and listen to them. Now, that is not a good situation. Within minutes after this happened, that woman had called one of the deacons of the church, who then called one of the elders who was there and verified that this, in fact, did happen. There was right before COVID. Years went by after that. The deacon actually went to the elders and said, "You've got to change this behavior. You cannot be doing this," because this wasn't the first time something similar to that had happened. But as an end result, one of the elders kind of conspired with another elder, and they began attacking another elder that wasn't there. So this massive kind of conflict kind of blew up and grew inside of the Lord's body. It was devastating to watch. That elder had been attacking other people before that. Many people had left the church as a result of it. And then what would happen is the leader would attack and then retreat into denial. Attack and retreat into denial. This went on for years. It ended up culminating in the church was notified that this was going on. And it created great havoc and great devastation. And I just want to say, we need to be very careful, because it can even happen in our leaders. It can happen to any of us. Brothers and sisters, if this sort of behavior can happen to an elder, it can happen to any of us. We need to watch out for it. We need to watch it in our marriages so that we're not attacking one another. We need to watch it with our children, with our friendships, among our brethren. And certainly if you're in any kind of a leadership role, please, my dear church family, become type 1 peacemakers, using type 2 peacemaking as a tool, intentionally using it as a tool to tamp down attacking, to tamp down peace breaking. It's a way to diffuse it. And that's what I want to emphasize this morning. So we have a very practical way that we can engage with people in our type 1 peacemaking to switch to type 2 peacemaking. Had that happened, had anybody involved in that situation, whether it was one of the deacons or one of the elders or even the congregation, had anybody really tried to engage in type 2 peacemaking? It was attempted, but perhaps not enough. Maybe the catastrophe could have been avoided. So I thank you for listening. We offer an invitation as a matter of tradition. We're going to do that now. If there's anybody who has any needs and would like the prayers of the congregation, or certainly if you have been thinking about becoming a Christian and are not yet baptized and want to do that, this is an opportunity for you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.